Hello, I'm Neve Barker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, calling university funding into question, protesters mainly in the US demand their schools divest from Israel for its war on Gaza. So how do they make their money? Who should rebuild Ukraine? The US moves to make Russia pay for its invasion. Moscow threatens to retaliate if billions of its state assets are confiscated. Sell TikTok or face a ban. The US is cracking down on the app's Chinese owner ByteDance. So how will it and millions of American businesses be affected? Now, from Columbia University in New York to the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, protests against Israel's war on Gaza spread across major American colleges. Protesters' demands vary in scope from school to school, but there is one common message: disclose and divest. Students want their universities to be more transparent about where their school's money is going and demand these institutions abandon a range of investments in companies they say are complicit in genocide. So does divestment work? We'll discuss that with our guest shortly. But first, Kulthum Sharif reports.
A chant that's become an anthem at major colleges in the United States. Students from campuses in the East Coast to the West have united their voice against Israel's war on Gaza that's killed nearly 35,000 Palestinians since October. At Columbia University in New York, where protests began more than 2 weeks ago, there are calls for divestment from Israel. The Ivy League school has an endowment fund of nearly $14 billion. Protesters want the institution to sever ties with companies linked with Israel or are profiting from its war on Gaza. They include tech giants like Google and Microsoft, defense companies like Lockheed Martin, and investment firm BlackRock, among others.
This is not a matter of simply violating university rules. This is a movement, an anti-war movement.
The university has so far refused to divest from Israel, but offered to make investments in health and education in Gaza. Students reacted by taking over a campus building. The police were called in to clear them out. Demonstrations have spread to several colleges in the US with similar calls to disclose and divest. At Harvard, the richest university in the US with an endowment fund of more than $50 billion, protesting students wanted to reinvest resources in Palestinian academic initiatives, communities, and culture. And at University of Southern California, they've called for the school to end its study abroad programs in Israel. Hundreds of students and several teachers have been arrested across the country. But protesters say they will not stop.
The instances of brutal state violence go to show that our universities are scared, and that is why they're overreacting with violence, because they know the students have the power. They know the students across the country are united for divestment.
From campuses in the US, protests have spread to several colleges in Europe. For months now, global mass demonstrations have been calling for a ceasefire. From the streets, the chants are echoing in campuses the world over, with calls to divest from Israel. Kulthum Sharif, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
So how do universities make their money? Well, they rely on tax-exempt donations that run into billions of dollars to fund things like scholarships, research, and even staff salaries. The National Association of College and University Business Officers says at least 700 institutions hold nearly $840 billion in endowment assets. Colleges and universities invest this money across financial markets and stocks, hedge funds, businesses, and real estate. Protesting students want their universities to withdraw or divest their endowments from Israeli companies and businesses that profit from Israel's war on Gaza. They want the money to be reallocated to more ethical investment ventures, which in turn can pressure a company or government to change policies. And there's a history of student activists targeting endowments during demonstrations. In the 1980s, they successfully persuaded universities to divest from apartheid South Africa. And more recently, universities have divested from fossil fuels and private prisons. Well, joining us from New York is Melanie Kamet. She's a professor and director of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. A very, very warm welcome to you. Thanks for joining us. And when it comes to these investments, the buying of stocks and shares, how much due diligence do universities across the United States do before they spend their cash, before they invest their money?
Well, they usually boards of universities, corporations of universities are in charge of establishing the general investment strategy. So they can instruct their investment managers what to invest in broad terms or what to avoid. But most of the time, university boards outsource the management of university endowments, university funds to professional investment managers. So they're not in the weeds of exactly what is going on. As I said, they can adopt broad principles of what they do and do not want to invest in, but they're not necessarily deeply involved in what choices are made for specific assets to be invested in.
In that respect, practically, how easy is it then for universities to divest from Israel?
I mean, it's certainly possible, but it's not easy in the sense of turning around immediately. First of all, this is taking under the assumption that this is a choice that universities would make. And that choice itself, I think, is going to be a complicated one because of the polarizing nature of this issue in the United States. But let's say that decision was adopted. It is operationally complex because it's difficult to get the micro level data to know what exactly is in investment portfolios, but it's not impossible. It just would take some work and it would not be a fast turnaround decision.
Now, we've seen the success of divestment in the past, particularly when it comes to apartheid South Africa. What is different this time around, do you think?
Yeah, so this is a much more polarizing issue at present. Now, let me emphasize that South Africa was not a done deal from the beginning. This is a campaign that took years and years in the making to come to fruition. So these kinds of divestment campaigns can work, but they often don't work overnight. Now, the question of Israel-Palestine is particularly polarizing in the United States. And so I think this is a very tall order. It's more complicated as well because you have a lot of congressional intervention here, as we know from what's going on regarding Israel and the campus dramas that are playing out right now. There's also donor interest in Israel as well, donors that are major contributors to American institutions. And so this makes it all the more complex, this issue. It's more polarizing than, let's say, climate change or tobacco has been, these kinds of public health issues that have guided investment and divestment decisions on university campuses.
What about the potential financial impact on places of learning, universities across the US, because students have potentially been expelled or simply put off wanting to study at these kind of institutions because of the handling of all of this?
So, well, this is a really challenging issue right now in the United States. And what's interesting, if you look across the landscape of universities where these protests are playing out, university administrations have adopted radically different approaches, ranging from arrests and expulsions and so forth. As you mentioned, there are a couple of universities that have adopted a more conciliatory approach and have agreed to actually speak with protesters, like, for example, Brown University or Northwestern University. So there's a divergence of approaches here. But there's definitely across the board concerns about divestment, and universities are very worried about drops in their endowment values and on the returns from endowments. And so this is a major concern that divestment will affect the value of endowment payouts.
Of course, behind all of this is a desire to direct Israel, to shape its foreign policy, to have an influence on the next decisions that it makes in regards to the war in Gaza. How much do you think will divestment actually impact Israel?
So my sense is that financially it will have a minimal effect. But this is not necessarily about the financial ramifications of divestment. It's more about the moral ramifications. And so divestment is as much an ethical, moral campaign as it is a financial campaign. And I think that's where the impact promises to be more profound, because causes that are at the center of divestment campaigns are causes that become debates about moral and ethical issues. And so I think this is the real issue, is what's the impact of divestment campaigns on public opinion around the American relationship with Israel, and particularly support for Israel's military activities.
All right, Melanie Kamek, great to have you on Counting the Cost.
Great, thank you so much.
Now, the war in Gaza has led to renewed calls to boycott Israeli products. For years, Palestinians have urged international sanctions to be imposed in order to pressure Israel to end its occupation. But for many in the occupied West Bank, Israel's stranglehold on the economy is a major obstacle for the boycott movement. Nida Ibrahim has more from Bethlehem.
Around the world, people are echoing Palestinian calls to boycott and sanction Israel. Activists widened the focus after the war on Gaza and are now targeting multinational companies that showed support to Israel. The sales of McDonald's and Starbucks, amongst others, have declined and their stocks took a hit. But in the occupied territory, Israel dominates the economy. This leaves Palestinians with little to no free choice when it comes to spending their money.
For me, boycott is one way of resisting the Israeli occupation. Yes, we can't fully boycott because they control our water, fuel and electricity. But if I can inflict 35% losses instead of 100%, then I will.
It's hard to measure the losses from the boycott campaign, but it boosted Palestinian businesses like this soda factory. Soon, these cans will make their way to Jordan, where boycott of Israel has been growing.
Israel controls our import and export, and they often impose heavy fines and taxes on our raw materials. We know it's because they don't want Palestinians to have factories and an independent economy.
Palestinians do not control their borders, so all exports and imports are subjected to Israel's restrictions, bans and closures. These restrictions have forced the first Palestinian mushroom company to shut down. It was open to challenge the Israeli domination of the market. Saleh Hijazi is a founder of the company and an activist in the boycott campaign.
What apartheid Israel tries to do is break the Palestinians, dominate the Palestinians. And that includes keeping them at a disadvantage economically. So to keep the economy under control, to force their own economy on you, products, so on.
But the Israeli authorities have little control over homemade products like these. This is a local initiative to support small-scale projects making handmade soap, crafts and food.
For many, boycotting Israeli products also gives people the opportunity to support small projects. Any money that does not go to Israel, they say, will instead help support a Palestinian family survive the difficult economic conditions.
Nida Ibrahim, Al Jazeera, the occupied West Bank, Palestine.
According to the World Bank, $411 billion is needed to rebuild Ukraine. The US and its allies want Moscow to pay for its invasion. Congress has passed a bill that could allow Kyiv to use some of Russia's frozen assets. Western nations froze $300 billion in Russian foreign holdings at the start of the conflict. And most of that money is held in European financial institutions. The Kremlin has now threatened to retaliate if its assets are confiscated. Well, Russia's RIA state news agency says the West stands to lose assets worth $288 billion if its frozen funds are seized. According to RIA, the top investors in the Russian economy include Cyprus, with more than $98 billion. The Netherlands with $50 billion and the UK with nearly $19 billion. It also reports that Germany has $17 billion invested, France $16 billion and Italy almost 13 billion. Germany has pushed back on the plan to use frozen Russian assets. It fears it could set a precedent and lead to new lawsuits against the country for World War II crimes. Berlin has paid $90 billion in payments as compensation to Holocaust survivors and their families. The US roughly has $5 billion in Russian assets and is unlikely to seize them without the agreement of the Group of 7 nations and the European Union. The issue will be discussed at the upcoming G7 summit in Italy in June. Well, joining us now from Brussels is Teresa Fallon. She's the director of the Center for Russia, Europe and Asian Studies and is a senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. A very warm welcome to Counting the Cost. So, the US very much going it alone with these measures against Russia. How are they being viewed there in Europe? And is the EU likely to follow suit?
Well, inside the US, there's even consternation about this. Some legal scholars would argue that this move is unlawful. Nevertheless, it could set dangerous precedents for other US allies, for example, Israel. From the European perspective, as you noted, Germany is very concerned about war reparations that Poland and Greece routinely ask for. And Japan, which is part of the G7, is also concerned how South Korea would ask for war reparations. So this could just be one way of bringing Russia to the negotiating table. It's difficult at this moment to know how much of it is carrot and how much of it is stick.
Of course, Russia has several potential levers to pull itself as well, given, as we mentioned in the introduction there, how much European money is deep into the Russian economy. What are the repercussions of Russia hitting back for the EU and the Eurozone?
They have been seizing assets from various companies, and others are quietly continuing to do work in Russia. So they want to preserve their already existing investments. We saw at the beginning of the war, the oil industry just pulled out and left like 25 billion on the table. So they understood that this might be a long-term war, whereas some Mittelstand companies from Germany and Italy is also very deeply concerned about their enterprises. So this is a lever that can be used by Russia to kind of divide and conquer European opinion on this. This will be, I imagine that there will be some sort of a compromise agreement worked out at the G7.
Can Russia in any way push back legally against this attempt to make the country pay for the invasion, pay for the ongoing conflict in Ukraine?
It is unprecedented in international law. So there are some legal questions. And if we start pulling on some of the tapestry of international legal agreements, the whole thing might unravel. So Russia has complained that this is a form of international piracy. And they really thought that by parking a lot of their assets abroad, that they would be safe. So this is also being watched very closely and carefully by Beijing, who is also trying to learn ways to protect their assets should any cross-strait crisis with Taiwan blow up into conflict.
You mentioned Beijing there, because one of the things noticed since the start of the conflict is the direction that Moscow is now looking when it comes to its investments and increase in exports, looking very much to China, looking very much to India. I wonder what happens to global trade should the wrong levers be pulled too soon, perhaps, by the EU and by the United States?
I think Europe is very apprehensive. They have made it very clear they're not going to do anything this year on this, that they might consider it in 2025. So they're kind of crossing the river by feeling the stones to see how this will move. I think the US is trying to kind of pull them along by passing this legislation, but it's unclear what action the US will take right now. I think they are trying to pull other countries within to influence them. But there's also demands by Central Eastern European leaders, fearful that with the new Trump administration, should he win the election, the US election, that all bets are off. So Putin is gambling that Trump will be reelected and that he'll have a better outcome. So there's a time element involved in all of this as well. So I think there's a big gamble going on here. Putin will see how he plays it out, if he can spin this as long as possible, with the Europeans waiting to see how the election turns out as well. So they're not willing to stick their neck out either. As you noted in your earlier programming, that the most of the Russian assets are parked throughout Europe. So that Europe really has a lot at stake here. The US has only about 5 to 6 billion.
Now, despite close to 17,000 individual sanctions against Russia imposed by the US and partner countries, despite an exodus of hundreds of major international companies, McDonald's, IKEA, to name a few, the International Monetary Fund expects Russia's economy, nevertheless, to grow in 2024. Almost double that of what the United Kingdom is expected to achieve. Sanctions appear not to have really hit their mark in Moscow, have they?
Exactly. And we've seen incredible ability of Russia to get around sanctions. We've seen increases, for example, 300% exports from Kazakhstan and Armenia, for example. So companies are finding routes to get around sanctions. So this is going to be a big issue. This also sends a positive message to Beijing that proposed sanctions or promised sanctions, should they do anything, might not really be as watertight as they might have expected prior to their observed experience of what Russia has gone through. So there's a will, there's a way, and we've also seen a lot of, Russia has oil that they've been able to export in a gray zone way, which is actually quite dangerous for the environment. There's a lot of leakage, but they've had a lot of money coming in from that. And they're backed by China. They have a lot of increased trade with China. China has been filling that gap. And there are questions about how much China is actually aiding Russia's base for keeping up the war in Ukraine.
All right, Teresa Fallon, great to have you on Counting the Cost. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sell up or vanish from American stores. President Joe Biden has signed a bill that could lead to a nationwide ban on TikTok if its Chinese owner ByteDance doesn't divest from the app. But the deadline is in about a year's time. That's after the 2024 election. Politicians are worried TikTok may share sensitive user data with the Chinese government. The company has always denied the allegations and says it will challenge what it calls an unconstitutional law in court. Well, the stakes are high for TikTok, losing its biggest market with 170 million users. The video sharing app helps generate billions of dollars for more than 7 million American businesses and supports more than 224,000 jobs. The legal battle could take months or years to settle. Meanwhile, TikTok will likely still be available in the US. India banned TikTok in 2020, while other countries, including Britain, Australia, Canada and France, have blocked it on official devices. We'll discuss all of this. Joining me now from Berlin is Friederike Kalthuner. She's a tech policy expert. A very warm welcome to you. So let me start by asking you this. Was the US, or is the US, right about its fears surrounding TikTok and its parent company, ByteDance?
I think the fears are correct. The response raises some really serious questions and consider bad precedent. So there are basically two main concerns about TikTok. The first one is, like any other social media app, TikTok collects vast amounts of data. And the fear is that because the Chinese government has a lot of influence over companies in its territory, like ByteDance, the fear is that the Chinese government could access data on over 170 million US Americans. So that's the privacy fear. The second fear is about manipulation and election interference. TikTok is so popular because its algorithm is really good at recommending content. It's very hard to see from the outset how and why content is recommended and how content is being moderated. Again, the American fear here is that this means that the app could be influenced by the Chinese government to spread misinformation, for censorship, and to influence the elections. So those are the concerns. However, there are many things the US government could do instead of banning the app wholesale.
If the ban does go into force, it won't be for at least 9 months' time. And the assumption is that there may well be some legal pushback from TikTok and its parent company, ByteDance, as well. It does beg the question, therefore, is this purely a political move, especially as one former US President Donald Trump seemed keen on banning TikTok too?
I don't think this is a purely political move. There seems to be a bipartisan support or bipartisan concern about TikTok. Trump tried to ban the app. When he was in office. It failed due to a legal challenge. Now this is the second attempt at banning the app. We will expect legal challenges coming from TikTok, who claim that a ban violates the First Amendment. So I don't think it's cynical. There are real concerns. It's still a very bold move to just ban an entire app when the United States, for instance, could implement a comprehensive data privacy law that currently doesn't exist. The US could implement a platform law or like platform regulation, such as the European Union has, that would force all social media apps, including TikTok, to be much, much more transparent about how they operate.
Microsoft, Oracle, even Walmart have been flagged as potential buyers of TikTok. How do you go about buying a company like this? And how much does it even cost?
I think, first of all, the question is, would ByteDance even want to sell TikTok? So the Chinese government passed a law that means the government has to agree to any purchase of critical technology, and TikTok and its algorithm have been deemed critical. So the first question is, would the Chinese government even agree to a sale of TikTok? The second one is the price tag. TikTok, the US is TikTok's largest market. I already said 170 million users. Last year, the Financial Times reported 16 billion in sale. There are very few American companies that could even afford a purchase of an app like TikTok.
Given the number of users in the United States and indeed globally, it does beg the question, what sort of impact a ban on TikTok there would have on small businesses, for instance, that use TikTok as a really important marketing tool, for instance?
Well, we've seen from other countries, India has banned TikTok a few years ago. We've seen that small businesses, influencers moved on to other platforms. Not all people who have a large following on TikTok have the same following, let's say, on Instagram or on other apps. So there's a question whether some people lose out in this move. But we've generally seen that people shift to other apps when an app gets banned.
Is there any scope here? Is there any scope here, sorry to interrupt, for China to potentially retaliate if this ban goes ahead?
A lot of American apps are already banned in China. I think it's definitely not a positive step towards good US-Chinese relationships.
OK, Frederica Kaltuna, great to have you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Well, that's our show for this week. Get in touch with us on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Niamh Barker. And do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC, Counting the Cost. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. Well, that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Niamh Barker, and from the whole team, thanks for joining us. The news is next here on Al Jazeera.